Good evening, everybody. I am delighted to welcome you in person and also online to this annual public policy lecture on behalf of the Department of Politics and International Studies and of the Bennett Institute in Public Policy, and also in particular on behalf of the MPhil in Public Policy program. For those of you, although I see a lot of familiar faces that don't know me, I'm Cristina Peñasco. I'm the director of the MPP and an affiliated researcher to the Bennett Institute. And it's my great pleasure to give this introduction today to the 2021 annual public policy lecture on population, the missing factor in climate and biodiversity policy with Professor Partha Dasgupta. First, just a couple of, or three of housekeeping notes to help ensure this is an enjoyable event for everyone. As you may have noticed, as I said, this is a hybrid event. So if you are joining us here in this wonderful venue at Fitzwilliam College, the college is operating in a distant way. So if you can keep separated, that's perfect. Please wear a face covering when indoors, unless you are exempt for any health reasons. There are no fire alarm tests scheduled, so if there is any fire alarm, please make your way to a Stories Way car park or the Huntington Road car park. Hopefully, we won't need this advice. Please turn off the volume of your mobile phones, but if you want to take pictures, do it, but without a flash. The event is being recorded, so you will not be seen, but if you ask a question later, and I really hope, because of the topic and how important this is to engage in question and answers, you will be here by those joining online as well as here in the room. We will make the recording available through the channels of the Bennett Institute later on. For the people joining online and for accessibility issues and reasons, closed captions can be turned on or off by clicking the CC closed caption button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. However, I must warn that this might not be very helpful anyway with my accent, so I apologize in advance. After the main lecture, there will be as I said, questions to our guest speaker. And if you are in the room, I will ask you to raise your hands and we will bring you a microphone. Brianna and Konstantin, that welcome you outside, are two of the students of the fantastic group of 36 MPP candidates, and they have gratefully volunteered to help with that. And if you are online, then you can type your questions in the Q&A function of Zoom, and I will try to ask as many as possible. You will see as well in the slide that you can tweet about the event. We have the traditional channels of the Bennett Institute and the Department of Politics under the hashtag biodiversity. And before I give the floor, I would like to say a few words about the MPP. This year, the Department of Politics and International Studies has received the 9th cohort in the history of an executive multidisciplinary program in which young and promising policymakers come to acquire a set of tools that will allow them to design and deliver reflective and effective evidence-based policies. If we look at it from a statistical thinking perspective, a subject that our students love, by the way, 33% of our cohorts have been affected by COVID disruptions. This, however, has not prevented them and prevent probably any of us here in this room from keeping being passionate about public policy and about analyzing the issues that impact our societies from a range of very different angles and perspectives through the channels of dialogue, cooperation, and fruitful discussion. I want to give a special thanks to them, our students, for having been brave enough to join the program in the uncertain and challenging moment we are currently living, and for allowing us to share our time with them. I think I speak on behalf of the whole team of the MPP, that if I say every day, we not only teach them, but we also learn a lot from them, so thank you. And talking about challenges, what is more challenging these days than understanding the intricacies of climate change and biodiversity in economics and in policy? So without further delay, it's an honor for me to now hand over to my colleague, Bennett Professor of Public Policy and co-director of the Bennett Institute, Diane Coyle, who will introduce our distinguished speaker, Professor Partha Dasgupta. Thank you. Thank you, Diane.
Thank you, Cristina. I'm only going to detain you for a minute or two longer. Polis, as our home department, is a broad interdisciplinary department ranging from political thought, the global south, political economy, policy, gender, and the Bennett Institute for Public Policy, which is now about 3.5 years old, is similarly committed to interdisciplinary academic and policy research into the major challenges that are facing the world, as well as the high quality teaching of the knowledge and skills needed in public service. So this annual public policy lecture is an opportunity to explore some of the big issues being discussed in the policy sphere. And so it's a real pleasure for me to introduce our colleague from Cambridge's Department of Economics, Professor Partha Dasgupta, to give this evening's lecture. Partha is Frank Ramsey Professor Emeritus of Economics here and a Fellow of St. John's College. And his research interests and his wide-ranging and profound work range from the economics of poverty, nutrition, environmental economics, measurement, welfare, development economics, technological change, resources, social capital. And so you can see wide-ranging, but also all focused on the fundamental question of what it is that's going to address the big challenges that we're all facing. And as Cristina said, what could be more significant than the challenges that we're faced with regard to the natural world, biodiversity, as well as climate change. So Partha is, of course, most recently known for his absolutely seminal report delivered to the Treasury on the economics of biodiversity, or as it's better known, the Dasgupta Review. And so I think that's enough from me. This is all about putting nature at the center of economics. And I'm going to hand over to Partha to give his lecture this evening. Partha, thank you.
Thank you very much. Pleasure and an honor to be here. Can you hear me well? Is that, if I move around and suddenly you lose me, raise a hand or shout, or say something which will draw my attention. Good. The ideas and findings I want to explore with you this evening form the basis of the review of the Economics of Biodiversity, which Diane referred to just a few minutes ago, which was an independent global report I was asked to prepare in spring 2019 by the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, and was submitted in early February this year. The review's conceptual frame was developed in a series of articles I had co-authored over the years in pretty nearly every combination of authorships. Figure out how many combinations you can get out of 3 or 4 names. And my co-authors were Scott Barrett, Aisha Dasgupta, Paul Ehrlich, and the late Carl Johan Mehler. The papers were published in a variety of journals, including Nature, Environmental and Resource Economics, Science, Population and Development Review, and the Proceedings of the US National Academy of Sciences. Full citations to these works appear in my review, meaning that they offer an alternative entry into it, so you can enter it through technical articles if you like. My debt to my co-authors and to my team at the Treasury, who contributed to the review itself, is self-evident to me, but I feel this is a good occasion to acknowledge it verbally. Not so long ago, by which I mean the years immediately following the Second World War, the economic questions requiring urgent attention could safely be studied by excluding nature from formal economic reasoning. As the human economy was small relative to the biosphere, and Europe and Asia needed to rise from the ashes of the war, it made economic sense to focus on the accumulation of produced capital, by which I mean roads, buildings, ports, equipment, machines, all the stuff you see around you, and human capital, health and education. Unfortunately, the resulting macroeconomic models of poverty, growth, and development so directed the way economists in academia, national governments, and international organizations collect and analyze data today that it has become commonplace that we can continue to bypass nature. And in what follows, I shall refer to nature sometimes as the biosphere, and when I'm feeling aggressively like an economist, I'll call it natural capital. They are missing in economic models. That belief has been strengthened by the fact that the average person today enjoys a far higher income, is less likely to be in extreme poverty, and lives significantly longer than she did even 70 years ago. The 70 years, 1950, is going to be really crucial for our understanding of why nature has been neglected and why today it's a disaster to do so. Since 1950, the global expectancy of life at birth has risen from 46 years to 73 years. And extreme poverty has dropped from more than 60% of the global population to some 10% today. The world economy has grown more than 15-fold to over $130 trillion GDP a year at purchasing power parity. And I want to show you this diagram because this general feature of this diagram is going to appear in the next 2 slides as well. This one plots time from 1750 to 2019. On the vertical axis is real GDP, purchasing power parity, and this is global GDP, okay? Notice how it was pretty flat till about 1900, rising slightly to 1950, and then from 1950 it took off. It's risen, as I said, about 15-fold since then. This is a commonplace figure these days, comes up with the carbon emissions and so forth. It's the sort of hockey stick diagram, okay? And so much so that now, these days, many ecologists, earth scientists regard 1950 as the year which we entered the Anthropocene, the human-dominated planet. Right. What about global per capita income, the average standard of living? That too has risen. And it has increased 5-fold to over $17,000 at purchasing power parity per year now. And there are 5.3 billion more people today to enjoy that increase. For world population today, 7.8 billion. So notice all 3 have shown a remarkable common phenomenon of having sort of accelerated from about 1950. So that's the good news. These are good things. Ignore now for the moment distributional issues. I'm looking at global averages. It's good news. But to have continued to ignore nature in growth and development economics and the economics of poverty has proved to be hopelessly wrong. For nature is our home. We are embedded in nature. And the human economy today is large relative to nature's ability to supply goods and services we need. And I will show that in a few minutes. In this lecture, I want first to sketch how contemporary economic thinking can be modified to correct for that mistake. I want then to use the sketch to discuss a factor that contributes to the problems we have created in our relationship with the rest of nature, but are absent from current thinking, be it at COP26 or at the forthcoming COP15, which namely human numbers. Despite its title, the review is not directly about biodiversity. Instead, it constructs the economics of the biosphere, as large a canvas as a social scientist can hope to find. And I have to tell you, I really am very fortunate that I was asked by the Chancellor to write on this, because I mean, how can you pass up the opportunity of working on the entire biosphere? It's sort of a stroke of luck. The review conceives the biosphere as a collection of interlinked ecosystems, which differ among one another in their spatial extent, ranging from a hedgehog's gut to biomes such as the tropical rainforests, and in the natural processes operating at different speeds that govern them, from microseconds to thousands of years. Ecologists have found that when defined carefully, biodiversity, which means the diversity of life, contributes to the productivity of ecosystems. That is, their ability to provide us with the multitude of goods and services we need, not just for our enjoyment, but for our survival. The review thus reduces the economics of biodiversity to the study of asset management problems, faced by as diverse a set of agents as individuals and households, firms, communities, nations, and humanity at large. But that means assessing whether the economic path we are following is sustainable requires a system of economic accounts that keep a record of an economy's entire stock of assets. For ecosystems are, of course, stocks of assets, which is another way of saying that we should be interested in the economy's wealth. It is now a commonplace to call the measure inclusive wealth, the qualifier inclusive being added to stress that the measure includes nature. A nation's inclusive wealth is the sum of the social worth of its stocks of produced capital, human capital, and natural capital. That wealth should form the basis of economic reasoning is intuitively clear. What we leave behind for our children, and thus by extension, by recursion, for posterity, are assets. But the reason we should be interested in inclusive wealth is that the measure corresponds to well-being across the generations. This is extremely important for me to convey to you. It's not an arbitrary index that I've plucked from air and saying, well, this is what we should be measuring. I have to show that that's the thing we ought to be measuring. For it can be shown that when either increases, that is, inclusive wealth, or well-being across the generation, the other does too. And when either of them declines, so does the other. Wealth and well-being across the generations are, of course, not the same object, but they move in tandem with each other. And that's the reason. If we're interested in well-being across the generations, not just ours, but our children and our grandchildren and so forth, then it is inclusive wealth which we ought to be measuring because it corresponds to wealth, to well-being. The contemporary practice of using gross domestic product, GDP, to judge economic performance is based on a faulty application of economics. GDP is a flow, so many market dollars of final output per year. In contrast to inclusive wealth, which is a stock, it is the social worth of the economy's entire portfolio of assets. Moreover, GDP does not record depreciation of capital assets, capital stocks. An economy could be enjoying high growth rates of GDP even while it destroys natural capital at a furious rate, which, as I show, is exactly what has been happening. People living directly on nature would feel the loss, and they do, those who live, fishermen, foresters, and others, but national accounts would not record it. As a measure of economic activity, GDP is indispensable in short-run macroeconomic analysis and management, but it is wholly unsuitable for appraising investment projects and identifying sustainable development. The founding father of economics after the wealth of nations, not the GDP of nations. The idea of wealth that is developed in my review, is not surprisingly a lot richer than the one Adam Smith was able to fashion. But his identification of assets as the object of interest was exactly right. In recent years, much valuable work has been done in estimating movements over time in the wealth of nations, the inclusive wealth of nations. For example, the ongoing work sponsored by the United Nations Environment Programme based in Nairobi, and more recently at our Bennett Institute here. And it is encouraging that national statistical offices in various countries, including the UK, are increasingly preparing natural capital accounts, which will be a component of inclusive wealth. The biosphere is a self-regenerative asset, supplying us with a bewildering variety of services, such as climate regulation, decomposition of waste. Don't forget that, ever. All the autumn leaves that fall eventually become part of the soil. Nitrogen fixation, air and water purification, soil regeneration, and pollination, among many others. Those gifts and the many that I'm unable to list because they remain unknown are today referred to as nature's regulating and maintenance services. They are to be contrasted with provisional goods, food, water, timber, fibers, and non-living material. We have increasingly drawn on nature's regulating and maintenance services to provide ourselves with provisioning goods by mining ecosystems and transforming the landscape. Land use change, as it is called generically. There is thus an inevitable tension between provisioning goods on the one hand and regulating and maintenance services on the other. But regulating and maintenance services are fundamental. Without them, there would be no provisional goods. They're the basis on which everything works. So when I speak of a shrinking of the biosphere, I mean a decline in nature's ability to supply regulating and maintenance services caused by our ever-increasing demand for provisioning goods. And here is the alarming finding. The processes that govern the biosphere's ability to provide regulating and maintenance services are complementary to one another. They're not independent of each other, nor are they substitutes. And by complementary, I mean that if you draw down one such service, for example, climate regulation, sufficiently, if you do that sufficiently, you will draw down others in due course. For example, biodiversity, and the link between biodiversity and biodiversity loss and climate change has been regularly featured in newspapers these days. Nature is, to be sure, resilient. It has, after all, evolved over 4.5 billion years and will remain so, will be here when we are all gone, the whole of our species is gone. But we humans of today are so powerful that we could, if we put our mind to it, bring nature down like a house of cards. And of course, the house of cards is an extreme example of complementary goods. One card is removed and the whole thing falls apart. Recent concerns over global climate change and biodiversity loss are an acknowledgement of that possibility. A characteristic of nature of supreme importance is mobility. The wind blows, rivers flow, the oceans circulate, and birds and insects fly, which is why and how our activities have consequences that are felt elsewhere and in the future. Moreover, many of nature's processes are both silent and invisible. Think of all processes taking place under our feet. We don't hear them, we don't see them. That makes them easy to overlook until, of course, they're affected so adversely that we become aware of them, as we are currently, of the value of biodiversity and climate regulation. We engage in many activities that have deleterious consequences, but for which we are not charged, and over whose use we have little inner urge to exercise restraint. Overuse of the oceans, land use changes leading to rising biodiversity loss, and unsustainable carbon emissions are prominent examples. Economists call the unaccounted consequences for others of our actions externalities. Globally, the magnitude of the environmental externalities we have inflicted on one another and on our descendants has become gigantic. One study sponsored by UNEP has found that during 1992 to 2014, produced capital per person globally doubled, and human capital per capita increased by 15%, but natural capital per capita declined by 40%. And this diagram shows that feature. The top curve is the time series of per capita produced capital from 1992 to 2014. Second one below is human capital per capita, and the third is natural capital per capita. The first two have been in an ascending mode, the last, third, a descending one. In short, the demands we have made of nature's goods and services have for some decades exceeded her ability to supply them on a sustainable basis. Because the difference between demand and sustainable supply is met by a diminution of nature, the gap has been increasing, threatening our descendants' life. You demand more than she can supply. Of course, the only way actually she's able to do that is by reducing herself, weakening herself. It's like drawing more fish out of a fish pond than is able to regenerate. Okay? We have been collectively damaging nature at an alarming rate, with biodiversity declining faster than at any time in human history. Extinction rates of species today are some 100 to 1,000 times the background extinction rate over the past several million years, of 0.1 to 1 per million species per year. It is a commonplace today that the biosphere's processes are nonlinear. What is less appreciated is that the nonlinearities harbor tipping points beyond which the natural environment would be found to be radically different from the one in which our economies have evolved over the past centuries. COVID-19 has shown us what might be just the tip of the iceberg if we continue overexploiting nature. Our overreach on the biosphere can be read as an ever-increasing size of the adverse externalities acting on the finite Earth system. So I'm giving you this thing in different ways of looking at it. That helps you in deciding how to look for policies. This overreach has been made so quickly that the moral language and the institutions we have created over the centuries in the West are inadequate for responding to them. We call the gap between demand and the humanity makes of the biosphere's goods and services and the biosphere's ability to meet that demand on a sustainable basis, the impact inequality. And I want to show you that in the next slide, but I'm unable to get it. Can somebody help? I want to move to the next. There we are, yes. Okay. It's not so much, it is a slide, it's not a figure. So let me just work through it without looking at a text. We're trying to simplify by thinking of the stuff we draw on nature, okay? And then what she's capable of offering us. So the image I wanted to have, and it's not a bad one to use, is that of a fishery. You've got a stock of fish. There's a natural regenerative rate, birth rate minus death rate, okay? And you are fishing. So you're taking fish out. Now, if you take fish out at a rate greater than its net reproduction rate, then of course the stock declines, okay? And if it can't decline forever, it's going to collapse in due course. So that's the idea that we want to explore. So I'm going to imagine now that we have accounting prices or weights that we can award these various services so that we can think of them as scalars. So I can talk about demand for the services as a scalar and supply of these services as a scalar. Scalar means a number, okay, not a vector. Human activities are what drives our demand. And the neatest human index of human activity would be a GDP. It's a close enough associate. It doesn't pick up everything, that's for sure. But we are looking at movements, remember. So if one is proportional to the other, it doesn't matter. So I'm going to use GDP as my index of human activity. And I'm going to write that, decompose it in terms of total population. I'm looking at the globe as a whole, okay? Total population, N, and small y, which I denote as the standard of living or per capita GDP. So N times Y is global GDP. But that's expressed in dollars, goods, in real terms. And what we're taking from nature are the services. So I need a conversion factor. So I'm going to call alpha the efficiency with which we draw upon nature and convert them into goods and services, the provisional goods that we're looking at, okay? That's the idea. The higher the alpha, the more we can get by using the same amount of nature's goods and services. And of course, immediately you can see that the economics of climate change is focused on that. Get clean energy rather than dirty energy, dirty sources, which is another way of saying we have the same amount of energy, but impose far less pressure, inflict far less pressure on the biosphere's ability to regulate climate, okay? Now, I'm emphasizing that because in some sense, it's an extremely misleading picture that the climate change literature has given us, to think that we can solve these problems technologically. In the issues of biodiversity, that's not on. Nevertheless, I've got my global demand, the impact, if you like, N times Y divided by alpha on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, I have the production function, the output of nature, the provisioning, and all that stuff that's provisioning and maintenance services. And that's, of course, a function of the stock. G is greater, the more higher S is. But at the moment, demand exceeds supply. All right? And it does so by shrinking S. This is a snapshot, remember. It's not a dynamic model. I can embed that in a dynamic model, and I've done that in the review. But this is not the place for it. So you could think of it sequentially. If it's one day, the left-hand side exceeds the right-hand side, tomorrow's S will be lower. Thus, and if other things remain the same, the gap will increase. Okay? So that's the basic story. You could think of G as Earth's carrying capacity, if that's the language you like to use. That's perfectly okay. And the left-hand side was called impact by a famous paper by Paul Ehrlich and John Holdren. And this impact inequality, including the right-hand side to make the whole story fit, was done in a paper that came out last year in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, co-authored by myself with Scott Barrett and Aisha Dasgupta, and about 20 other economists, ecologists, earth scientists, and anthropologists. So it's a paper I'm very proud of. Okay. What is the gap like now? One estimate is that the ratio of demand to supply, in other words, the ratio of the left-hand side to the right-hand side, is today about 1.6. And that gives you the metaphor that we need 1.6 Earths. You may have read about that sometimes in newspapers. We need 1.6 Earths to satisfy our needs on a sustainable basis. Of course, we don't have an extra 0.6. All right. The impact inequality enables us to screen targets that are often set, as for example, the United Nations target for achieving its Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. A question that is rarely asked, if ever, is this: even if they're sustainable by 2030, are the SDGs themselves sustainable? I'm sort of suggesting these questions because I knew there were going to be students here. If you look at the review, you'll see hundreds of possible research problems that need to be studied. Using such data as are available, it can be shown that if the world economy grows at the rate at which it has in recent decades, the efficiency parameter alpha would have to increase by 2030 at 4 to 5 times the rate that has been experienced in the past 3 decades. In other words, I don't think it's a starter. It's not even a starter. What we have to do, of course, is to reduce the left-hand side, increase the right-hand side to bring them into equality. To raise the right-hand side is another way of saying invest in nature. But investing in nature means in many cases, means leaving nature alone. Investment in my kind of world is waiting, not drilling, not building yet another building, if you see what I mean. In other words, it carries a different picture of the enterprise. And of course, the other thing to be done on the left-hand side is to see that in future, the numerator reduces. Okay, these exercises that I've been just given are even cruder than what social scientists today are comfortable with. But that is because such questions as these continue not to be asked. There is an urgent need for demographers, ecologists, economists, and earth scientists to collaborate in shifting the research agenda on humanity's common future. Now, I've so far been framing the problem of sustainable development, that is, in this case, bringing the two into equality, because this is the really urgent need now. Sustainable development can be thought of as increasing inclusive wealth. That's the right way of looking at it. But just at the moment we are in a firefighting situation, this component is the key, in my judgment. More urgently, the impact inequality is reduced to inequality is what we need to aim for. But it's in entirely aggregate terms. How does the distribution of incomes affect the impact inequality? More particularly, how does the global income distribution affect global ecological footprint? Which is, of course, again, another expression for the left-hand side is footprint. Okay, so sometimes it's called impact. I call it impact here, but it could be called the footprint. And you can also call it the demand. That doesn't matter, so long as we know what we're talking about, what we're drawing on to nature. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reported from cross-national statistics that carbon emissions are an increasing function of income. there is a corresponding finding that says that a rich person's ecological footprint exceeds that of a poor person. Okay, that's commonplace, it seems. However, the data also says that the marginal footprint declines with increasing income, as you can see from this graph that is plotted, and it appears in my review. On the horizontal axis is income, and on the vertical axis is ecological footprint of a person with that income, corresponding income. It increases, which is exactly what you would expect. An average Englishman or English person, I guess, has a bigger footprint than a peasant in Sub-Saharan Africa. That's fair enough. The problem is, and you can see the tension, these social sciences are very, you have to have thick skin to practice social science, because every now and then you come across uncomfortable truths. And this is an uncomfortable truth, because it says at the margin, the footprint declines. And so it means that if you're an egalitarian, as many of us are, when you look at very extreme income differences, and take $1 from a rich person and give it to a poor person, the aggregate, the total, the two together will have a bigger footprint than before. So that's an awkward thing, because it suggests that if you go for equality, which we do, it means we have to accept the need for a drop in the average. Okay? That's a depressing finding, but that's how it is. And it needs to be taken into account. You can't simply say that because in the absolute term, richer people consume more than poorer people, then that the margin, it's the same. The exercise I've just conducted was on the distribution of global GDP. That is the distribution of capital N times Y. But what about N itself, population? And in the rest of this lecture, I'll speak to that. I've taken this time to get to it because I wanted to show you that it's organically what we are led to. Global population today is 7.8 billion. That is a bit over thrice the global population only 70 years ago. The United Nations Population Division has applied Bayesian methodology on demographic data to make population projections in various regions of the world. Figure 7 traces their median estimates. These are the median estimates. These are done by regions. The top one, the top band, is Sub-Saharan Africa, and I'll be speaking to that now for a very good reason, as you can see. That band is increasing. We're looking at where is it from? It's from 1950, yes? The time horizon is 1950 to 2100. Okay, so these are the projections of population that came out only 2 years ago by the United Nations Population Division. And you can see the sum of these regions is Sub-Saharan Africa, Central and Southern Asia, Eastern and Southern Asia, Northern Africa, Latin America and Caribbean, Europe and North America, and so forth and so on. Okay, so the whole world is covered there. And you don't have to go into the details. The one I really am keen on is to look at the top one, which the band is growing, and the others which together are showing a dip after 1970 or so. Okay, not so the top one. Top one is not showing a dip. It's the others which are beginning to. This is broadly speaking the situation. In these median estimates, global population in year 2100 is projected to be 10.9 billion. With the exceptions of Asia and Africa, population in the rest of the world, when taken as an aggregate, is projected to stabilize in a few years. Asia's population is projected to grow from the current 4.1 billion to a bit over 5 billion in mid-century, and then taper to a bit under 5 billion. I'm just describing that for your convenience. In sharp contrast, Sub-Saharan Africa's population is projected to rise from its current 1.1 billion or so to 3.8 billion. The projections include, by the way, in women's education as a factor in fertility rates. I have many friends in Sub-Saharan Africa, most of whom have been students of mine at teaching workshops organized by the networks of economists in Eastern and Southern Africa that I helped to found with the help from the UK, Swedish, and Canadian aid agencies. The exercises that I now want to conduct, and to conclude my lecture, speak to the future that my friends, my old students, and their children and grandchildren face. It is not a happenstance that much of nature's biodiversity resides in the tropics, nor that the bulk of the world's poorest people live there. To the best of my knowledge, received growth and development economics and the economics of poverty do not acknowledge that there is a transfer of wealth from poor countries to rich countries when poor countries export primary products to rich countries under a system of governance where markets for nature's maintenance and regulating services are missing. To illustrate, imagine a country exporting timber harvested from upstream forests. Deforestation causes loss of biodiversity and degrades the functioning of the ecosystems both at the site and downstream. For example, soil erosion, increased sedimentation of land and fisheries. As the adverse externalities are not reflected in the export price, the export carries with it a transfer of wealth from the exporting country to the importing country. The wealth transfer remains hidden because they're missing from a body of statistics that does not record the eroded natural capital stock of the exporting country. Rural communities in the world's poorest regions rely for the most part on raw materials: timber, fibers, water, medicinal herbs, mud, dung, that are obtained from their local ecosystems. These features of contemporary economies pose a cruel dilemma. Poor countries that are dependent on their export of primary products for raising their living standard lose a part of their wealth to rich importers each year in the form of degraded ecosystems locally. Now that's a scandal. If you, in raw terms, what you're having is a transfer of wealth from the rich to the poor. Meanwhile, their populations grow at a high rate, and I'll show you in a minute what the numbers are, making larger demands on local ecosystems and leading to greater land use change. That is not a viable state of affairs. That the World Trade Organization does not acknowledge such wealth transfers when advancing the cause of trade liberalization reflects the absence of natural capital in contemporary macroeconomic reasoning. It is often argued that population is not a problem. Dinner table conversations is what I'm going by the way. At the global level, because growth in global numbers is slowing down, the growth is slowing down, as this diagram shows, and the impact inequality is driven by high consumption per capita in rich countries. The problem with the first argument is that nature responds to the demands that are made of her, as the impact inequality showed. It was the actual demand. She does not recognize the rate of change of demands, nor the rate of change of the rate of change of demands. Nature does not know Newton's differential calculus. She just sees what we take out of it and has to respond to it. So first and second derivatives are of no use to her to understand this problem. Growth in global population, so long as it is positive, will make further demands on nature services, other things equal, of course. The second argument is a non sequitur when we study the plight of the world's poorest regions. Per capita GDP in sub-Saharan Africa is only 25% of the global GDP per capita. In the aggregate, the region's GDP is about 3 to 4% of global GDP. That means sub-Saharan Africa is not remotely responsible for the current global impact inequality. It's unimportant in terms of the global demands it makes. Okay? The demands that it makes has a global impact. But the region's high population growth rate can be expected to dampen the prospects of future Africans of enjoying a flourishing life. And when I mention my students there, and their children and their grandchildren, it's that which I want to focus on. The region's ecological footprint will increase as its numbers rise and attempts are made to raise incomes by exporting more. And you've seen the vicious cycle that involves, losing wealth even as it tries to increase incomes by diminishing its local ecosystems. The evidence is uncompromising. To not acknowledge that fact is to work against the interest of the common African citizen, that the ecological footprint will be increasing as its numbers increase, and as attempts are made to raise the incomes by exporting more. The evidence is uncompromising. The fertility rate in sub-Saharan Africa today is 4.6. Nigeria's is 5.4. And remember, the replacement fertility rate is, as you know, about 2.1. And population is projected to grow in sub-Saharan Africa at 2.6% a year over the near future. A transition to a replacement rate in, say, 20 years' time rather than in 14 years' time, transition means from these current high levels to 2.1, in, say, 20 years' time rather than in 40 years' time would mean a massive lowering of their projected population size in 2070 and would reduce the pressure population would inflict on their local ecosystems. I keep on hanging on about their local ecosystems because it's they we should be worried about, not the rest of us. That should be the backdrop against which future economic prospects in the region are discussed. Demography has had an uneasy relationship with economics because culture has traditionally been taken to be a slower changing factor in human behavior than other factors. That culture matters is a truism even among economists. What is in contention is how rigid they are against a changing milieu. But culture would not appear to be as immutable as it is imagined to be among decision makers all too reluctant to discuss population growth. For culture adapts when people find it in their interest to adapt and also have the facility to adapt. The rapid fertility transition in Taiwan from a high of 4 in 1970 to the replacement rate of 2.1 in 1984, a mere 14 years, is an example of how cultural norms can change in a society previously regarded condescendingly as traditional. It was an achievement of economic demographers to have shown empirically that households' reproductive behavior is as amenable to economic analysis as is their food consumption. That fertility rates decline as incomes grow, other things equal, is a finding in economic demography. The explanation usually offered is that income growth is usually traceable to rising wages, and rising wages, especially women's wages, in their turn raise the value of time, making childbearing and child-rearing more costly. It's a feature that I found immensely unusable and useless when we look at poor countries. And it needless to say, this line of reasoning was invented in Chicago. In recent years, women's education has been seen instead by development experts as the surest route to women's empowerment, including, for example, choice over birth spacing. That's extremely important. Increasing birth spacing reduces maternal mortality rates, infant mortality rates, and so forth. Quite apart from anything else, it enables a person to choose, a woman to choose, which she might not otherwise be able to do. All governments today recognize the importance of women's education for empowering women. Unfortunately, the micro-evidence is more than mixed. For education involves more than school buildings. Teaching material needs to be provided, and teachers themselves need to be educated. Moreover, there needs to be a guarantee that teachers take their classes. There are tons of work done at the micro level in South Asia, in Africa, show that buildings may be there, but the schools are not functioning. Achieving each of these requirements, these complementary requirements for education to work, requires citizens' insistence that each of the factors is attended to. There is evidence that the combination has proved hard to achieve in the world's poorest countries. Even today, nearly 30% of women between 15 and 24 of age in low-income countries remain illiterate. And I mentioned 15 to 24 only because, of course, education has become a prime target for aid programs in the recent decades. So we're looking at the youngest generation. The success of Bangladesh in bringing about a fertility transition speaks to another factor: the availability of modern family planning and reproductive health programs to poor countries, to poor households. The programs designed there, and I should emphasize, NGOs have had an enormous presence in them, have involved providers working with households and village leaders in bringing the facilities to the doorstep. It's not just a question of having a facility sitting in the urban area and waiting for people to come. They've actually gone there. Male partners were involved in discussions. It would seem as though, in contrast to education, family planning and reproductive health programs offer a low-hanging fruit. Fertility rate in Bangladesh dropped from 7 in 1971, the year the country was founded, to under 2 today, even though literacy rate amongst women there remained a low 70%. Utterly poor in 1971, Bangladesh is today a middle-income country in the World Bank's rankings. In contrast, only about 50% of women in Sub-Saharan Africa who want to avoid pregnancy currently use modern methods. And not to have this facility is an insult to the notion of human empowerment. Women don't have control over their own bodies. This is a very simple thing. That OECD countries allocate less than 1% of their aid budget to family planning and reproductive health, and that the UK government in its last budget reduced its paltry allocation to the same by 85% is unconscionable. Now, in this lecture, I've tried to show a fact of life that should be self-evident, but isn't in received growth and development economics and the economics of biodiversity. And the economics of poverty, I'm so sorry. It is that every facet of our lives is bound up in nature, for we are ourselves a part of nature. That the economic policies a government chooses should be based on evidence is today an incontrovertible requirement. But it is of no use if the evidence is obtained from an inadequate or misleading model of the human condition. For poor or faulty models produce spurious evidence. Systems of thought that do not acknowledge humanity's embeddedness in nature when used to project the present and future possibilities open to us mislead. The received economics of growth and development and the economics of poverty remains impoverished. It reads as an elaborate exercise in collective solipsism. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Partha. Can you hear us adequately? Okay, thank you so much for such thought-provoking, I think, talk. I mean, you have touched, if I go through my notes, through biodiversity losses and climate trade-offs, market failures, the need of national accounts that consider natural capital and or social capital in a way that they don't do yet. You mentioned also population projections, the role of trade, women empowerment, and also the large amount of disappearing species that we are seeing around every day. Are we being, I think my first question to you, to give time to the audience to pose their own questions, are we being too naive thinking that we can solve all these issues? And I'm thinking of the COP26, just with keeping global warming below 2 degrees, 1.5 degree by the end of the century, and establishing a global carbon tax? What are your views?
Well, look, very good questions, that impossible to answer. Depends where you are. Fortunately, I'm not in government. I'm not a decision maker at the UN or such institutions. I'm a teacher and researcher, I guess. So the objects I can study and work with and try and discuss are different. I don't, although I pick the whole thing in terms of global statistics, most of my work, and I think most people would like to see things at the micro level, at the level of the household and our lives. And I think what I tried to do in the review is not really talk about taxes, things like there's no corresponding thing like a carbon tax in the case of the economics of nature. And in some sense, we've become very spoiled by the economics of climate change in thinking that there is one parameter we can shift, either target for how much of emissions or the corresponding thing in terms of target. What is needed here is not that difficult. I mean, in a conversation, in a discussion I had with Nick Stern at the COP26 in meetings in Glasgow, we had a discussion with a panel. It was chaired by the head of the United Nations Environment Program. It was suggested by Nick that it's such a difficult subject, the economics of nature, which is what we've been discussing here, the economics of biodiversity. In some sense it is, but in other ways it's not. It's really a question of the grammar needs to change, and once you do that, your day-to-day activities should be informed by that. So take, for example, cost-benefit analysis. You are interested in investment projects. The Treasury is interested in investment projects because it spends money. Now, what criteria should it use to do the cost-benefit analysis? Well, what this says, we've laid out apparently a uniform platform for doing that, includes natural capital in it, and it should do its rate of return calculations with that in mind, so the costs and benefits associated with it. That's not easy work, but it's not impossible work, and plenty of work has been done in that direction. So at every institution, whether it's the household, start from the household and work yourself way up to the international level, what we need to do is to just use our economic logic to see how to solve the problem at the level that you're studying. So take the global case, which is what you started with, and that's a very reasonable thing to do. We have the open oceans, the open seas, which are a global public good. Without the oceans, we are all dead, by the way. And that's about 65 to 70% of the Earth's surface. Now, the open oceans will be, say, anything beyond the 200-mile EEZ, okay? So, and that's a lot of space. That's a global common public good, but it's a common property resource. Nobody owns it, and therefore, everybody thinks we all own it. Nobody owns it, and we overuse it. It's the tragedy of the commons, writ large. Now, we use it, think of all the transport that takes place, traffic. Billions of dollars, trillions of dollars annually are shipped across the Pacific in these container ships and so forth. And fisheries, deep sea fishing goes on, plus all the stuff that we throw into the oceans to contaminate it. The oceans are in serious trouble. So take that case. Okay. Take another global public good, which are the tropical rainforest. Another global public good of enormous significance, and I don't have to explain why, but they're within national jurisdiction. So you have two different sets of problems. Now, what would an economist say we should do? You would say, well, we ought to have an international institution, organization created to manage these. Now, managing what? The first one is easier because it's a global public good, open access, should manage it by charging for our use of it. That's a very standard technique. So let's do that. That would raise billions of dollars a year. So very crude calculations suggest that. What about the other one? They are in national jurisdiction. Amazonia, you have in the Congo, and in the Southeast Asia, Malaysia. And what we do, we are observing their deforestation, and we moan and groan, saying this shouldn't happen. They're terrible people, they're doing it. And they in turn say, well, it's all very well for you to say, but we need to develop, and you know you like beef, so you're going to transform some of Amazonia into cattle farms, and we're doing that. And take down another bit to have soybean plantations and so forth. And who are you to tell us? Because it's our property, and it's benefiting you. And they are right. Now, you may not believe their statistics, but that's not the point. The point is that there's a gap between their incentive and the global incentive. So the right thing to do is to pay them to protect the forest. And we have that in national jurisdiction. We have payment for ecosystem services these days. The United Kingdom practices it. Costa Rica does, China does, and so forth. Now, you could use that revenue that I've just now mentioned, that huge amount of revenue we could generate, and then subsidize these countries. Not subsidize, actually pay for it. And of course, these days, monitoring whether they're cheating or not is easy. You've got all these satellites up there. You can actually see what's happening in a very fine-tuned way. But this issue is not being discussed at COP26, nor COP15. So that's at the global level. And as I say, at each level, you can ask, what would economics, good old-fashioned economics, but including nature at every stage, tell us to do? And so I think it's not that difficult.
So it can be reconciled. I mean, I guess my next question will be around these issues. So we are mostly focusing, or I have this feeling as well because of my work, on reducing emissions and so on, but we know there are all these trade-offs. So we know, for example, that we need land in order to have carbon capture, natural-based solution, carbon capture, but we need land use in order to keep biodiversity alive, in order to, as you mentioned, directly feed the populations. How can we reconcile this? Because it seems to be now more a little bit on the agenda, and pioneers like you are working on these issues, but how can we foster not only governments, but as you mentioned, communities, what communities need in order to reconcile these agendas?
Again, a very tough question you've asked. It's very geographically located. If I start with this latter part of your question, which is what do we do about communities, I think leaving alone communities would be a first great step. In fact, we have interfered, the urban population have interfered with rural communities for far too long. Indigenous populations are the first to tell you that, look, leave us alone rather than take our stuff away, which is what we're doing. Communities, there's a huge, interesting literature that was created by anthropologists, economic anthropologists and social anthropologists, and the review goes into it too, in the middle sections, on the way communities have created institutions, local institutions, to handle local ecosystems, local forests, water holes and so forth, a grazing field, shedding, and so forth. And markets are not the basis on which these transactions take place there, and we know that. There are as many institutions there, norms of behavior, social norms that have evolved as there are ecosystems, if you like. You know, what happens in the tropics is not the same as in the tundra and so forth and so on. So one of the tragedies of, in my judgment, of modern economic planning and modern economic thinking has been in some sense to override those institutions, and they have been very damaging to local people. So one thing we could do is to actually hold off from them and instead work on ourselves. We urbans who are so far removed from nature. And of course, these in civilized, these enlightened bits of countries, like I like to think Cambridge sort of area, well, there are lots of enterprises which are trying to create green spaces. And that's exactly right. And we ought to also, of course, lobby our government to move to a system of accounting. I began with national accounts, for example. So all these things are complementary. If we do that, the idea that we know what we want at the end of the day and what will happen in the future, I think it's wrong. I think we can't predict. What we need to do is to get the institutions right, so the incentives are right, taking into account the relative costs, if you like, as perceived by the people in question of the various types of assets they hold. And innovations will take place in line with the motivations and will take us in a trajectory we cannot foresee. But at least we'll have got the prices right, quote unquote. I mean, I don't mean it in a vulgar way. I mean, we feel the relative scarcities of goods and services. And I think that's a good enough prescription on which to proceed. We're not inventing a new language. It's more, economics is a great subject, it's a fantastic subject, it's just that we have misused it. And if we just follow the reasoning by including this incredibly rich asset, which is continually missed, I think will take us a long way.
Yeah, really good luck that certain governments could listen to this kind of messages. That said, I mean, I think I have abused a little bit already my privileged position. So I would like to open the floor and the audience for questions. I will start with the room in person here, but please, people online, feel free to type in the Q&A function of your Zoom chat, of your Zoom account, sorry, any questions, and I will try to pose a couple of them later on. Any question from the floor? Nari?
Thank you, Professor Dasgupta. So I would like to ask about payment for ecosystem services. So usually the success case works in small countries, but in densely populated countries like Indonesia, where resources are usually allocated within the community collectively, what kind of policy that we can implement to provide incentives for the community to implement payment for ecosystem services?
I missed her question completely. I'm afraid the mask.
Can
Could you, do you mind?
briefly?
Oh,
Yeah.
thank you very much.
Payment for ecosystem services usually work for smaller countries, but in densely populated countries like Indonesia, where the resources are often managed collectively within the community, what kind of policies can we implement to somewhat force or reinforce payment for ecosystem services? Like what kind of policy intervention that we need in national and local government? Like how should we start?
Well, it's far beyond me to speak to individual countries and their problems, but I think I gave the hint that, which is that deforestation, for example, the kind of problem that you just mentioned, has huge numbers of externalities. And I think instead of sitting and trying to estimate what the externalities are, it's best if the governments could be persuaded to send experts to go and find out how the changing landscape is affecting people downstream. And there is work on that kind going on, but that's mainly by academics who have actually tried to estimate these externalities, which are pretty significant. We're looking at 20–30% distortion. That's not a joke, particularly when that 20–30% falls on some of the poorest people in your society. Then, of course, you should magnify that if you want to give some distributional weight to the poorest. And once you do that, then there is many things that you can do. You can start legislating that polluters should pay. And here, the corresponding thing of pollution is deforestation. And I gave that example in my lecture of how exports are wealth transferring. I did it precisely because of the point that you've just now made. It is precisely because the person who is being affected adversely, the poor fishermen downstream and so forth in your example, are not on the calculation of the national leaders, if you like, that we face a problem. And of course, it exasperates. You can look at it by saying, well, of course, this is causing greater deforestation. So the conservationists would like it anyway. But you can approach the problem from a different angle, which is the human rights, the pollutees being harmed. So if there's a pollutee's rights, that would be like, she shouldn't be, the person who's being damaged should not be expected to pay the other person for refraining from destroying the forest. It should be the destroyer of the forest who should be paying for the harm that the downstream farmer or the fisherman is facing. So that's the line of reasoning that we need to. The exact numbers, of course, depends a lot on the legal structure, but that's the line of reasoning that needs to go. Yeah.
Thank you. Dolly in the middle.
Thank you so much. I'll take my mask off if that's okay. Thank you so much for your beautiful review. It was genuinely one of the most exciting reads. And to avoid the sadly too typical 10-year review follow-up that says, you know, not much has happened and things are still terrible, what do you expect or should happen with your review next? What has been the follow-up? And what are the key things that will happen?
The Treasury has been amazingly supportive of the review. I should say it immediately. The review was launched on 2nd of February, so we're looking at precisely 10 months ago. Okay, is that right? Yes, 10 months. I think I'm right. Yes, yes. Instant arithmetic eludes me at the moment. So 10 months. But the Treasury, first of all, prepared a response. It's about a 25–30-page document and was entirely positive. And remember, my review did not give a time frame because that would be wrong of me. I couldn't possibly do that. I was offering a grammar of reasoning, nothing more. Okay, reshaping, reconstructing economics, so to speak. And they kept my team, part of my team, not the whole, because we don't need the whole team. The senior members of the team have remained and will remain until the end of this calendar year. So there's been an 11-month support of the team. And why were they there? Well, they were there for two reasons. One was to work with their colleagues. The team was in the main from government departments, Treasury, DEFRA, and so forth. And the part of their responsibility was to work with their counterparts, their colleagues in these departments to bring the message across. So there was subversion, if you like, internally. And the other thing was to arrange for dissemination. So you would find it astonishing, and I find it astonishing. I've now been a party to more than 200 events since then. Every working day, pretty much one or two such events, which could be lectures like now, or it could be Q&As, interviews, and panel discussions and so forth across the world. And of course, I didn't have to move outside my home because everything is done by Zoom. Okay, so that's there, no question about it. Having said that, of course, pretty much within months, the FCDO, the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, cut the aid budget for family planning by 85%. I mean, it's a small amount anyway, and cut it by 85% because it's not fashionable. And one reason my review, I mean, the main reason I was so interested in this issue and in my review is that it's something I've worked on for many years, not family planning per se, but population, because it's one of the factors that influence. On the other hand, it's not something that, for a variety of reasons, seems to be very low. And I've tried to show with quantitatively why it's a completely misplaced prejudice, if you like. Now, I think my guess is it'll be redressed because I made a lot of fuss about it. And since it doesn't cost very much, it's a cheap way of investment. I mean, it's ironic, isn't it? I mean, giving women a control over their bodies is cheap, but it is. So that will be all right. What happens in the future? I don't know. I have no idea. I've not been involved with COP26 or COP15, other than as an academic, of course. I have been lecturing to the Chinese various agencies since then, and I will be giving a lecture next week there. I can only hope that the grammar proves to be very reasonable. It's such an obvious extension of what we do. It's not rocket science. I mean, conceptually it is, because it really does take completely in a different frame of reference, no question about it. I think the economics of growth and development that has developed over the past 70 years is a complete disaster. And yet, it's very fashionable. Graduate students love it because you can do dynamics, very nice dynamical equation, and you do regressions. The problem with the kind of econometrics techniques that have developed really is the following. You got a wrong model, you won't know that the regressions that you're getting are misleading you. And that's extremely important to recognize. You got a bad model, your results are going to be misleading. And so I think, in a way, I like to think the legacy of the review is going to be for the next generation of graduate students. That's where the action lies, because it is extremely easy to overlook the synergy between academia and government and international organizations. We like to think that we academic, or people like to think we academics are all abstract, pie in the sky, writing mathematical models and so forth. But today's decision makers are yesterday's students, my students actually. They're full of them in the Treasury, by the way, and rightly so too. But, and so there is a synergy between what government national models are, government models, the models that they work with in Treasury, Foreign Office, and so forth, and the models that appear in journals. They're very closely related, okay? And international organizations, the same thing. So it's that has to be snapped. It's not, I don't want to snap the relationship, but the source of the problem lies in us, in academic departments. And if you can do that, then things will follow. So I don't know if that makes sense to you.
Such an important message, I think, in the future of how we conceive economics. I can take one last question from the audience, and then I will move to some questions online because I don't want to keep the people online without asking anything. Ambika?
I just wanted to congratulate you on the review. One of the lines that you said, which really spoke to the environmentalist in me, which was investing in nature sometimes just involves leaving her alone. And, in India, we have the precautionary principle. We have the polluter pays principle. For about 20 years, we have successfully argued in won cases in court where we have said protecting the environment is basically my right to life, because it's my right to life to a healthy environment. We even had the Community Forest Rights Act, where basically people who, like tribal communities, indigenous communities who were reliant on the forest, could use forest produce. So that sort of helped them protect their forests. And yet we're in a situation where project after project is being approved by our national government, whether it's in the Northeast for palm oil, whether it's the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, and these are places that have such a emotional value for those of us from India. Now, I understand that we can't expect you to speak to each country because there are, just in the MPP, we represent 20 different countries, so we're fairly diverse, but for a developing country, which is sort of, this rush to really get where it's hoping to get, what policies do you suggest for those of us who are involved in the environmental sort of legal movements back home?
Well, these are wonderful questions. If only I knew how to answer them. But let me have a whack at it anyway. It's in line with the way I was trying to address the questions that have been raised earlier by previous people, which is goes to something like, yes, investment in nature is not an active activity necessarily. It could be passive, leaving it alone. And then somebody will say, well, why? Well, how is it earning me money, quote unquote? That's the standard argument. The back of our review and my lecture here is the notion of accounting prices. That is to say, the productivity of these ecosystems is what we should be trying to estimate. Okay? Now that can be done, and it is being done. And you need for that not economists, but economists in working in conjunction with ecologists. You need them, and with anthropologists, because they also understand the institutions that are, these productivities are not uneffective, so therefore you need a combination of action. And in fact, this has been done. A lot of people have worked on such problems as this, let's say, to study the productivity of mangroves, forests, or wetlands. Tons of work on that, by the way. You won't find them in economics textbooks, in economics journals, but you will find them in, at least in one journal that I helped to found, Environment and Development Economics, which has produced an enormous number of extremely interesting essays, studies of this sort, applied studies of this sort, of productivity of shrimp farms, the externalities that cultivated shrimp inflicts on the local ecosystems and so forth. They've been, of course, these will be all case studies. They'll differ from place to place, goes without saying. In other words, there's a lot of work to be done. So suppose you do that. In other words, you try and get the productivities. And the way you think of the productivity is something like this. You ask the question, say, let's give you a concrete example. Think of a grassland, okay, a wetland. And then you ask yourself, what does the wetland do? Well, one of the things it does, of course, is to clean water. Water flows in, and there is a natural cleansing process. So that's one. Let me just to save time, let's think of another one. Another one would be, well, since we have climate change, it houses carbon. Could be a peatland, for example. Okay. And the third would be that it houses insects, birds, which are pollinators. Okay, now armed with these three, ask yourself, or we could ask the question to the hard-boiled economist who says, now we need a network of roads which will transport goods, so we have to cut through this wetland. All right? So it's a standard kind of problem. And it yourself comes along and says, we don't like the idea, and then they'll say, well, show me the bottom line. This, if I have the network of roads, then we save on transport costs, goods get buried and so forth, and brings goodies to everybody and so forth, all right? And you lose. Well, you then have to argue the following way. You have to say, well, if you do that, it cuts into the wetland and it loses its productivity. Ask, for example, what it will do to a declining quality of water. Take the first case, okay? And there's a happen in the Catskill. Very famous example is the Catskill watershed. It was done. Well, if the water it doesn't get cleaned, how do you get it cleaned for the people, inhabitants who use that water downstream in maybe an urban area? Create a filtration plant. Well, that costs money. So you then say, well, now look, this is a service that's being provided free of charge by the wetland. And now you're saying you're going to trash the wetland and then create a produced capital to get the same amount of product. So you've got cost, you've got one benefit out. Next, let's just for the sake of this argument, carbon. Well, you look at the economics of climate change and take, I don't know, whatever, $50 a ton or $100 a ton of carbon price, and then you can talk about sequestration of carbon and the amount of carbon it would lose if you cut through and reduce the quality of the wetland. So that's another benefit. A third would be, pollination. And you can ask the agronomists to estimate what the loss in farm productivity would be for adjacent farms, agricultural land in the adjacent. And that too has been done. That kind of work has been done. Put them together and you get an estimate of the loss to the wetland arising out of, or something, because of the quality degradation arising out of the investment in the road network. And you have to do a juggling act of cost and benefit. At least you've got a foothold in the argument. And you'll have to show that, of course, typically, that it will be better not to do it in general, because for one very important reason, and I'll end with that, which is that you see the impact inequality is increasing, okay, as we showed in the previous diagrams, the UNEP, the Managi-Kumar diagram of natural capital declining and the others going up, which means that relatively there is less of the biosphere to the produced capital and human capital, which would mean the accounting price of natural capital will be increasing over time. That's a key, because when you invest, the waiting business, leaving it alone, and you say, well, where's the bottom line? Well, the bottom line is that every increment in its productivity in the future will be valued even higher than it is today, because natural capital is being degraded. So at the margin, its value goes up. So contrary to the hard-boiled economists who said, well, you use a 5% discount rate and that, that gain in 20 years' time by allowing this piece of natural capital to rejuvenate disappears, okay? You will say no, disappear because the value of that object relative to other things. That's like students who take that argument away with you, because it's very potent and it's also correct. It helps that it is correct, that it should be potent. So if you do that, then you get a long way off. That in social cost-benefit analysis, there is a common practice, it's a very understandable practice, of keeping relative prices constant over the duration of the project. Because you don't have any other assumption to make. You say, well, the benefits are $5 million a year, it's for the next 40 years. And what I'm arguing here is that that's wrong. It's wrong because if you have natural capital in it, its relative shadow price relative to produced capital and human capital will be rising. In fact, if it rises fast enough, even the discount rate you'd be using, effective discount rate, would be negative. In other words, future benefits will be amplified rather than attenuated when you look from now. So honestly, it's just amazing how much stuff is out there for us to mine to get economics, economic reasoning moving in the right direction. Thank you for asking me your question.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we are mostly out of time. We could run for ages, but I would like a last thought from your end, Professor Dasgupta, with one of the questions that the people online has posed, Binay, and I will adapt it a little bit. Do you think that pursuing economic growth can be balanced effectively by policymakers? And I wanted to use this one specifically because of the focus of the public policy lecture, with the immediacy of our current climate and biodiversity crisis?
Well, again, I mean, if I've understood you correctly, I think I wouldn't ask the question of economic growth. I would ask what growth we're looking at. And one of the things, I began the lecture by suggesting that we ought to be looking at growth in wealth, not in GDP. And if you look at the kind of work that the Bennett Institute is doing, for example, the natural capital accounts, and then amalgamating it with the other accounts to get a sense of national wealth, then growth should mean that. And the reason I was focusing for most of my talk, not on wealth, inclusive wealth, but on the impact inequality, is because that's the really urgent one thing to look at the moment. If you can fix that, you're halfway there, because the other commodities and the other assets are growing anyway at the moment, and we need to have a better balance of it. So I don't know what the net result is. It would be the wrong thing to do for me to predict whether increasing wealth means declining for a while of GDP. I have no idea. And one reason I don't have an idea is I don't know what the world looks like 20 degrees away from where we are, if you see what I mean. Because it's going to mean a real disruption to the national accounting system when we build natural capital properly into it. It's an ongoing work that's taking place. I'm pretty sanguine that this is one thing that will happen. National accounts will be changed because there's just too much of a argument in favor of changing it, and good people are involved in it. So I expect that to happen. But that's just one thing. National accounts on their own are signals, nothing more. At the end of the day, we need the criteria for policy. And I should end by saying one thing. Since so many students are here, I can't resist doing that. If you can give me one more minute.
Of course.
Inclusive wealth might seem to you as a new object, in the sense that its sustainability analysis led me and Carl Johan Mailer to write the equivalence theorem that I mentioned between them. But in fact, inclusive wealth, we've been using it all this time. Macroeconomists talk in terms of growth in GDP, okay? And growth models are telling you. Politicians talk in terms of desired growth rates. But if you ask them, well, how do you choose projects? What do they say? They say, well, we look for rates of return on investment, okay? Now, all right, so what does the rate of return add up to? What's the equivalent to that? The answer is net present value. You look for net present value of projects. I'm now not worried about whether it's market price or shadow price. Just suppose it's just market price for the sake of argument, because that's the practice. Well, what does net present value mean of benefits or profits? What does that mean? It means you're adding up weighted sum of the flow of net profits, right? The weights are the discount factors. But when you add flows, what do you get? You get a stock. Because you're adding flows over time. So when you add them up, you're getting a stock. So the net present value, if you use accounting prices, including natural capital of a project, is the change in the inclusive wealth that the project brings about. So we've been actually we've had this object in our sight for all these years, decades actually. At the moment we went into macroeconomic accounting, we forget it. So there is a kind of if you like, a schizophrenia here between sustainability analysis on the one hand and policy analysis on the other. In policy analysis or project evaluation, we use net present value. In sustainability analysis, we've been talking in terms of GDP. So again, if you get the grammar right, there's no contradiction.
Thanks so much. I think I will keep this idea of integrating different disciplines, different ways of seeing the problem, and of course about which kind of economics we want in the following years. and which kind of growth we want and how we growth. Thank you very much. Well, we could run the conversation for ages, I know, but before we finish, I would like to share a couple of announcements and acknowledgement. Watch out for the launch of the Bennett Prospect Public Policy Prize next week for the opportunity for early careers researchers and policy professionals to win £5,000. That is always welcome. And of course, last but not least, I would like you to join me in a couple of acknowledgements. First, the students that have volunteered to help with the event, and Rebecca Lim, Andrew Cuthbert, Livia Harriman, Lucy Hallinson, Malcolm and his IT team for the support with the whole organization of this event. Fitzwilliam College for providing this wonderful venue. Thanks to Professor Diane Coyle for her engagement with the inception of this lecture. And of course, the biggest thank to our invited speaker, Sir Partha Dasgupta, for his insightful and thought-provoking lecture. It has been absolutely fantastic having you tonight as our guest, so our most sincere thanks. And now, outside, we would love if you can join us for some refreshments to celebrate public policy. Thank you very much for being here. Thanks.